Actively managing your personal brand is critical if you want to make a significant impact in the areas of your life important to you. I'm Garry Browne, the Personal Brand Catalyst. I've spent most of my life working in the world of branding products. More recently, I've been exploring the world of personal branding and wrote a book on this, Brand New, Brand You. And the podcast has come out of this as a way to share first-hand experiences from some of Australia's most recognised personal brands. Hugh Riminton is a familiar face to millions of Australians. He is the National Affairs Editor at Network 10, former news anchor and correspondent for CNN, Channel 9, ABC, Radio National. Hugh is an award-winning journalist, humanitarian, news presenter, foreign correspondent, speaker and author. Hugh also is a board member of Crescent Institute, which was founded in 2000 to connect, inspire, empower and educate professionals of diverse backgrounds through high-caliber learning opportunities, and was a foundation board member of Soldier On, which supports Australian Defence personnel who have suffered through their service in recent wars, and previously a foundation board member of the John Mack Foundation, a charity set up by New South Wales Australian of the Year, Deng Adot, to honour his brother by promoting peace in South Sudan and providing scholarship for people from refugee backgrounds. Hugh has received numerous awards, including 2 Walkleys, a Logie, honours from the Human Rights Commission and the UN Association Media Award. Hugh, thank you very much for joining. It's a great privilege and pleasure. We've had many opportunities to engage previously, and to be able to join with you today and talk about personal branding is a real pleasure and privilege, because I see you as a real icon in the media space.
Well, it's nice to be with you, Garry. I'm not sure I agree with your with your very flattering assertion there,
But do you see yourself as a brand? Or as Hugh Riminton?
Yeah, well, in a sense, if you're in my game, I guess your name is your brand, but I don't. And it's interesting. The first time I heard anyone individually in journalism refer to themselves as a brand was when I worked for CNN. And I had a colleague who was, from California, a brilliant woman. And in some conversation, she said something like, "Yeah, I don't think that fits my brand." And I went, and I thought it was a joke. And I realized she wasn't joking. She had a very strong sense that she was a brand, and she was very much aware of what was in her brand and what was outside her brand. And I was frankly a little appalled at the thought that, your individual messiness was something as hard and corporate as a brand. Having said that, I was working for CNN, which was certainly, I think at that stage, we're talking 20 odd years ago, was the biggest news brand in the world. So.
It's funny you say that, because I always, when we meet, I always think of CNN and yourself.
Oh.
More so because from my perspective, and I wonder whether it's also viewers, that when they see someone who is in the media, especially in television, they either fit the profile or they don't. And so when you talk about brand and you talk about who you work for, are there organisations you feel as if you wouldn't work for because you wouldn't necessarily fit? Because whilst you don't define yourself as brand, you can see where you could fit and where you wouldn't.
Yes, I certainly would apply the rule that you should work for people you like to watch or read. In case of Channel 10, who I work with now, the branding in the age group is younger than I am, but I am very comfortable with our product, and I'm very happy. I believe in our news product, and so I'm very happy to be associated with that brand. If I wasn't, then I would leave it. There are certainly people I wouldn't work for because it wouldn't fit. Whether you want to define that as being a brand clash or just simply a sense of being uncomfortable with someone else's perspective on the world, on news, on what matters, on the values that are associated with it. I think it is very important to work with people whose values align with your own.
I totally agree, and I think that's certainly critical in life generally, and I'm sure in the media industry and sector, it's a challenge continually to try and balance your values. Is that something that you are continually confronting?
I don't confront it because I don't work for people, and I would not work for people whose values I couldn't embrace. And I can see that there are a whole bunch of industries and players within industries where people would feel conflicted by it. I was intrigued by, I had a colleague I worked with in journalism in the 1980s, and we were both very young men, who went on to a very high-level international position in public relations and corporate communications and so on. And he was saying how he looked for people who'd worked for tobacco companies and such like. And I thought, well, that's kind of pretty interesting. Why would you look for them? And he says, well, because they have dealt with complex issues in a hostile environment, and they have worked to improve the public to the degree that you can, the public standing of those outfits. Well, that's fine, but I could not admire people whose job it is to shill for a tobacco company. Sorry, couldn't do it. And, you know, I was offered a job some years back, by another old friend who tried to entice me into a particular corporate communications company that with promises of significant advances in my wealth. And he seemed to really enjoy it. And he was a man that I admired. I admired him as a journalist in his earlier life, and he plainly was enthusiastic for it. So I went home, thrilled at the prospect of doubling my wage. And, you know, it took 24 hours of that little sugar rush to think, well, at some point I'll be sitting in a boardroom advising a board or a CEO who has done some unconscionable thing, or their business has, and they're looking to get themselves off the hook, and they want my advice to help them. And I thought, well, if I don't want to be in that situation using my skills to deliver that outcome for them, the time to say no is now. So it was very easy to say no to the job.
I can understand that.
It didn't fit the values.
So what about, in terms of values, reporting on topics that maybe are against your values, or researching? Are there areas you would stay clear of because you just don't want to, or on the other hand, they are against your values and you actually want to hone in on it?
Well,
and that sort of bias or steers you in a certain direction.
Sure. I mean, so everything's going to be reported on, and I think that what you're looking for is stuff which is of public interest and which you are seeking to understand and report fairly, so that people have a better understanding of what that subject is. So, I mean, plainly, there are people who act contrary to my values who I'll be reporting on. Pedophiles, criminals, whatever. But, you know, it doesn't offend my values to report on them, because that's the job and the role. So, you know, I'm not troubled by that at all. And I think what I do, and what I think the much maligned mainstream media at its best does, is it seeks to understand and give a fair go to parties to a conflict or a discussion or whatever it might be, so that everyone gets a fair say in it. There's a lot of the social media world of people shouting and megaphoning particular viewpoints on any particular debate, and I think it's possibly diminishing as a desire of the public to have still that kind of umpire figure, more or less, who's saying, well, okay, there's that point of view, and then here's this point of view. There's been a lot of examination of the way in which the media reports falsehoods, and the degree to which merely reporting someone saying something which is false qualifies as balanced reporting. And I think I have a lot of sympathy for that argument. So I think we constantly need to be tested against our best selves in terms of reporting what's going on. But if you look at a matter like The Voice, which is a current debate across Australia, there are a lot of different points of view on it. Sometimes it gets heated, but our job in the middle is not to play sides on that, it's just to report it.
So what part does social media play in terms of what you've described in terms of values, but also how it potentially can affect your brand in the way in which you report?
Well, such a big subject. So if you went back 30 years ago, if you were in Sydney, the main news bulletin every night was the Channel 9 news bulletin read by Brian Henderson. It dominated the market. But Seven was trying to do the same thing, and others are trying to do the same thing. There were limited outlets, few newspapers, not many, few TV stations, not many. And all of them were looking for the centre, because the centre of the audience was where the numbers were and where the profits were to be. You know, even if you took aside all the arguments about trying to be centrist and flappable and all that kind of business, that was the nature of the game. Everyone was trying to get the Bell distribution curve and get the middle bit of it. 30 years ago, the media and the diet that people had naturally tended towards centrist views, and fringe views got very little chance to make it into a mainstream conversation. Now, with social media, the whole digitization of news, it's quite the opposite. If you can occupy a place at an extreme and own it, you can profit. And we see that with Fox in the United States, for example. There's no remote pretense by Fox in the United States that it's representing a kind of a broad view. It's not. And so what it's seeking to do is to pick out your bit and then completely own that bit. You'll do okay. And then on top of that, you have the social media element where everyone is a broadcaster, everyone's a publisher, and everyone can have whatever view, sometimes anonymously, and get followers and become quite influential into the debate. So all of that has fractured people's sense of what is real in the world. It is much more possible for people to find support systems for their own belief structures. At the extreme level, you see the kind of tragic lunacy of the group in Wiambala in rural Queensland who shot up the police. They had literally developed a worldview reinforced by only accessing other people who shared that worldview to the extent that they had almost created a kind of in the end, a murderous disconnect with reality.
Yes.
And so that's at the extreme elements of it. You see this in the United States happening increasingly. And that's a challenge for all of us. So the role for the mainstream media and the branding for an individual like myself in it is at its best, at our best, is to be aware of all of that, to fact check, to go with evidence-based information.
Absolutely.
And try to give people something that they can access, which is coherent, intelligent, thoughtful, and truthful.
Which gets back to the point of protecting your reputation.
Yes.
And that is a challenge in itself. Is that something that you learned early in your life about how to manage or protect your reputation? Is it something that you really think about on a daily basis? How is it that you formed a position to be able to protect yourself? Because in the media, you would get shot at in so many different directions because you're reporting information, news that not everyone agrees with.
Yeah, that's true. I think reputation is everything. I do think that you build on it, you work on it every single day. I had, in thinking about coming to chat with you, when I was a kid, when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, I had a little habit of nicking bits of small change and converting it into chocolate for the most part, sometimes fizzy drinks down at the shops. And I'd get caught from time to time. And on a particular occasion, my mum had lost or couldn't find $10, which in those days was a sum of money. And because of my reputation as someone who trousered spare bits of money, I got in a lot of trouble. As it happened, I hadn't nicked it. But I was punished as if I had for several days and sent to my room. I was in Perda there for a little while. And then my mum discovered that she'd put it aside for some reason and forgotten about it, and then had refound it, and she came up and sort of was curious as to why I'd borne up under this punishment when in fact I hadn't done it. I'd made my denials and then had given up on it because I recognised as a child that my reputation was that I was a thief of money, and so this was what comes with it. I realised that I didn't get the benefit of the doubt because I was the doubt. And
interesting.
And so that was an early lesson in reputation and reputational value. And and I saw my father who never got a degree, never got a diploma, was a highly respected member of the community. He ran a number of charities. He finished up for the last 20 years of his working life running a medical school. So a major job dealing with, highly academic workforce and, complex issues. And he did that purely on the basis of his integrity, his capacities and his reputation. And so this is no discovery to anyone watching this. Reputation is absolutely everything. And it can be trashed cruelly and unjustly in the sort of vituperous times that we live in. I'm very conscious I'm a white, middle-aged male, older than middle-aged, and I'm being too generous to myself there. And I'll get a lot of hammering across social media and all the rest of it, but it's nothing like what my female colleagues will get and nothing like my brown-skinned colleagues will get. And we've seen the nature of that, and that's appalling. People trying to tear people down and destroy their reputations. And of course, most of it's done anonymously, deeply unfairly. So sustaining a reputation in these times is difficult. What
do you employ in terms of within your toolbox to try and insulate that and protect yourself emotionally and also outwardly? Are there any methods by which you go about doing that? Because it can affect you.
It can affect people terribly.
Yeah.
One of my core beliefs is that people are entitled to have a say. That sort of freedom of speech thing is very, very strong with me. And there's also an inevitability. Most people are actually all right. But there are people who, again, particularly with anonymity, feel completely unleashed to say all kinds of dreadful things. And broadly speaking, my view is that is the game. It's not me, that's the game. I can let all that go through and past me. There's this notion of blocking people on social media and all this sort of business. And that's fair enough. I've probably blocked maybe a dozen people, 20 people, and they've got to be, for the most part, really vilely boring and consistent, in which case you just mute them, basically shut them out of the system. There have been a couple of cases which have gone to police because of the nature of the threats. After one particular incident, because there was a known capacity from a particular person, there were security elements that had to be introduced for a while into my life. But for the most part, I take the view that it is in the natural scheme of things that some people will be rude and nasty, and it really has nothing to do with me. And I don't engage with them. I don't shout back. I try to be generally polite or ignore them.
One would hope that others have the same sort of view, but it's a lot more difficult, I think, when they're consistent and people don't have understanding of the methods by which they can protect themselves.
Look, and I think also, let's be honest, women get a lot of sexualised abuse. And Stan Grant is a good friend of mine. So there is an enormous amount of racist abuse. And then it spreads to, he's spoken about that, to his wife. Having sexualised, racialised abuse. These are, when I talk about freedom of speech, there are plainly limits to what's tolerable. I've never felt the need for it myself, except when I've had some police support around a specific threat. I totally support people who get that kind of abuse taking police action. People have been charged for things that they've said about Stan and others, and more should be.
Totally agree. If we just go back to, you were talking about reputation and values, are there any occasions in your career where you've had your values tested, where you have been in a position where you've had to make a serious choice?
No, I've made mistakes in terms of reporting. I've made mistakes. I've identified people who shouldn't have been identified. I've put people who are vulnerable into positions where they've subsequently been threatened by others. Kind of rookie errors, not that I seek to be absolved through that, but in my early days as a foreign reporter, actually, not necessarily being sufficiently aware that things that are reported from, when you go overseas, you get material, you bring it back, you report it here. This was in the pre-internet age, the degree to which that could filter back to the place and action be taken against people. So I've learned lessons through other people's suffering, which is a very hard way to learn any lessons. That was early on in my career. I don't really feel as if I've had my values enormously challenged. I've been very lucky in that I've worked for all the ogres and the rogues. Bond, Skase, Kerry Packer. I worked for a grouping at 10 for a while there where Lachlan Murdoch, James Packer and Gina Reinhardt had stakes in Channel 10. And I used to have quite a lot to do with Lachlan Murdoch when he was the acting CEO of Channel 10. And it surprises and shocks some people that I never got any pressure, not a hint of pressure from Lachlan Murdoch. I would say if I had, to do any reporting in any particular way or the other. And I think partly that comes down to the question of reputation and brand. I think I've been around the game long enough that people know I'm not malleable and I'm not interested. And there's always the danger I'll call it out. So I'm an independent operator. I would always walk rather than do something dreadful and against my values. And I think people realize I'm not that person who can be pushed around. And also, I'm not looking for some sort of groveling advancement to some power, whether it's a billionaire or some other entity. And, please, will you stroke my head and give me some lollies? I'll do anything for you.
You're an independent.
There might be some operators like that out there. Probably not that many, but some. But plainly, I'm not one of them. And they, I think, read the room.
What about outside in the space of your community and voluntary work, you'd come across, I would imagine, a lot of different personalities, organisations, and that always has its sprinkling of uncertainty, if I could put it that way. Has it ever sort of, I mean, whether it be you've got such a diverse involvement in community organisations, has it ever come across there?
No. I've worked quite a bit with veterans, and some of the ones I've met and dealt with profoundly wounded and damaged by their experiences. In some cases, in a few cases, I've met and worked with people whose, if you were to deal with them with knowing nothing about them, you'd find them to be pretty unattractive people. Angry, swaggering, substance abusing. But I'm not seeing them without a sense of context. And so the very point of the work is to work with the people who are suffering the most.
Sure.
And so, there are people who, for example, would have a worldview which is a long way away from mine, particularly in the deeper reaches of damage, and particularly around violence and threats of violence and even just a kind of a broad anger, just a rage. But that can be symptomatic of the experiences they've gone through. If you want to work with veterans, you work with wonderful people, many of them veterans, fantastic people. You're also going to encounter people who are really struggling in a difficult way. And with those, you really just try to be there for them. And if you can be of practical use, but also just hear them out and kind of feel their storm and hope that they get some quietude out of it.
Well, that's the compassion in you to be able to take the time to help them through those processes.
I wish I had more time for it.
You talked earlier about one of where you're currently newsreader for Channel 10. Younger audience, they love you reading the news, your audience loves you. That to me...
They could love me more.
They could they?
If they could double the ratings, that would be fantastic.
That to me is a great signal of relevance. You might talk about the age difference or gap between the younger and yourself, but I see that as being relevant to your audience.
Well, I think one of the things about the television news audience is that the news audience tends to be older than the general audience.
But it's still relevance, right?
Well, what you hope to be. And I think one of the things about being one of the great things about journalism is that you're exposed to all people in every environment. And if you travel, as I've been privileged to do, not just internationally, which I've done a lot of work internationally, but also across Australia, rural and remote Australia. And I've done my darndest to get to almost every corner, every small town in Australia. That's a pleasure of mine. And in through the suburbs and all the rest of it. And consequently, you build this knowledge of how people live in our world now, in Australia now, in our streets now, and at all levels of society. And so I hope that somehow it conveys that I understand who's at the other end of the glass. So I don't purely work as a newsreader.
I realise that.
Because I'd find that, to be honest, too boring. But because what I really love is getting out, understanding issues, understanding people, being with people. And that's the great fun and privilege of the job.
Let me turn around the other way. Then when does a person like you who's so engaged in the community, in the issues of the day, etc., when do they become irrelevant?
When does the person become irrelevant?
When do you as a reporter become irrelevant?
Well, that's a decision for the boss.
But is it?
Well, I mean, the reality of it is, it's funny because it goes back to the question of brand. At a certain point, if you're going to work on television, your skill set accounts for this much of your pay. So my skill set as a reporter is that amount. And if there's anything above that, it's because there's a value as a marketing element, the network.
Absolutely.
That's it. So that bit is the brand bit, I suppose.
Correct.
And if the TV network was to decide that I didn't fit their brand or I wasn't any good or whatever it was, or I'm just too old or whatever it might be, they can reperceive my brand value and fling me or say, how about you just work on your skill level of pay or whatever it might be. I don't know. So it can always be taken away from you because better to market and that's how it works. But I'm not concerned with that because I still love every day going in, I love newsrooms. I love the people who are drawn to them, the curiosity and the banter and the just the life experience and the sense of teamwork.
Sure.
But I love the business of finding out what's going on.
But you use, other than news reading, you're doing many other activities that are media related, are they not?
Yes. I'm doing a lot of radio as well. And but a lot of it's just reporting, covering the major issues, working with team members to report and cover and to poke around and gently direct that we should look in various directions on things that are going on. And that's the fun of it.
And that's engaging your audience in a significant way.
Yes. Yeah, because you're doing nothing unless you're serving that audience.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so I always look at your relevance. If you're continually engaging your audience, then you're continually relevant.
That's the hope. And you want to be in tune with their issues and reflect their concerns and try to get some answers. Also report back to them when things that they've got a right to trust have failed them. So whether it's a robo-debt type of thing, which in all fairness, we were late to the party on reporting robo-debt to our shame, but there are other stories that are around.
Our being the media? Is that what you mean?
Well, I think broadly to the media, but I think us as well. And I think one of the evening news is probably not the right format to dig into those sorts of things. No. But it's a scandal of such profound meaning, asking such serious questions about the way in which the country is structured, the public service, the political system. That was a huge story that
didn't get exposure early enough in the piece.
Yeah. And part of the problem with that, and I'll just go briefly to that, is that the public servants knew in the beginning, before it was even written into the 2015-2016 budget, that it was unlawful and ineffective. They knew it. It's in the Royal Commission report. They'd done analysis of it. They'd found that if you use this robo-debt system, it was woefully inaccurate at actually calculating debt. So it wasn't something that you could rely on, and it was unlawful. And in a healthy system, there would have been protections for whistleblowers. If the ministers had determined to proceed on with it, there would have been healthy protection for whistleblowers to say, this thing doesn't work for these reasons. And they would have been protected to say it. Robo-debt would never have got to where it was. Yeah. But we have no protections for whistleblowers in this country, and it's disastrous for us as a consequence. And we really badly need those protections.
We have them in the corporate environment, in corporations, but we don't have them in the public environment.
Yes, I even wonder if in the corporate environment the protections are sufficient in my view. But then I'm going to say, as a journalist, that more transparency is always better.
I agree with you up to a point, because I think there has to be a balance sometimes.
Yes, I think that the thing is where things are unlawful,
then it has to
there must be transparency. And if you look at robo-debt, it was unlawful in conception. It was unlawful. Or put it this way, the advice was it is unlawful. It can be made lawful through legislation, but they never put up the legislation. So right from the start, it was, and all the way through, it was unlawful. And if that was to be happening in a corporate environment, if corporations are running unlawfully,
then they should be torn down
and
taken out
early before the damage goes through years and years and expands and expands.
Totally agree. So in your reporting, do you think about the way people perceive you?
No, I don't. And that's because I'm old. In a sense, I don't spend any time thinking about that.
Right.
I'm not concerned about how people perceive me. I don't care. It makes no difference to me how people perceive me. I don't think I'm about to run naked up Pitt Street, doing something stupid, because it's not in my nature to do that. There's a point that unless I have, a traumatic brain injury or some other tragic event, I'm unlikely to do anything differently to what I've been doing for many years. So there's a certain joy in getting older where you're not actually worried about what you might do or how people perceive you. And I don't. And I haven't done for years.
It's a really interesting response, because reputation is so important to you.
It is, yeah.
Obviously, you want to keep protecting it because of the way people would perceive you if you didn't, right?
But your security lies in your values. If your values are sound, you don't actually have to worry too much. You take stands on a whole bunch of things, and I've taken stands on all kinds of things internally within my outfit and previous employers, and also in terms of standing for vulnerable people, in particular stories who need the help of the media to get something out.
Yep.
And you make those stand, and you make at times powerful enemies.
But they're your beliefs.
Yes, and values, and I think it's not a bad thing to have as part of your reputation, a sense that you don't get pushed around, and that you will be just a little bit ferocious on behalf of someone who's been dudded, that you're not sitting there blandly writing or reporting, that you will be a little ferocious on their behalf, because when that happens, people know you're not bluffing, and you can affect some change from time to time.
Totally, that I appreciate, and I think that's where media has a really big part to play for those who don't have the voice to be able to protect themselves or the presence that others do.
Yeah, I think part of what we should do is be an equaliser in a world in which individuals at various times, through no fault of their own, sometimes through the malevolence of others or through institutional failure, vulnerable. And I think we could be a lot more active in equalising the balance for people when they're in that environment. And they're satisfying jobs, they're difficult jobs, but when you go into bat with righteous fury and then get a good result, that's a good day at the office.
So are those thoughts, your values and beliefs, have they changed over time?
No, but I think you get to learn the tools better.
Okay.
So I think what happens is you realise what's possible and what isn't. I often have this metaphor in my head that there are all kinds of things that are structurally wrong at any given time. Every so often you can see events will give you a little chink and you can stick your crowbar in and just snap the daylight in. And the crowbar is your media, the power of the media to go and look at something on behalf of someone. And then very often, of course, if it's bad for one person, it's bad for a whole bunch of people.
Exactly.
And so that's what you do when you can, but we don't do it as much as we possibly could because it's really difficult to find, if you like, the perfect victim against a kind of a monolithic structures of our society, the unfairness of it. And you need that to try to make it work.
You don't think that your beliefs have changed over time. It's more the tools you have to be able to deliver a better message and assist. Is there?
Yeah, I think they deepen over time. But I think the fundamental core value is the right to dignity, the right for an individual to have a place within the state. You know, that we have all these state apparatuses that the individual has a distinct right within that system.
Okay.
And that right is assigned to everybody equally. And so those belief systems are fundamental. So I don't know where particularly they come from, but I think from when I was very young, it comes from a horror at racism. And when I was a young child, the civil rights movement was very active in the United States. I was born in Sri Lanka. My early friends were brown-skinned folks. My sort of schooling thing, I don't know whether it was a combination of that and the civil rights movement. The fact that when I was a kid growing up in New Zealand, playing rugby with South Africa was a big issue. It was a big local issue. And I came down very firmly on the side, as was my family structure and values, that racism was an intolerable failure of the human endeavour.
Yes.
And at the heart of that was, you go back to the old Martin Luther King, the colour of the skin, but the content of the character. And if you don't know the content of an individual's character, because you don't necessarily know in a mass sense, the rule one applies. Everyone has an absolutely equal value, and their poverty or their wealth, but for the most part you're battling for those in poverty, should not in any way diminish that right. Those are core beliefs. They've never shifted. They can and never will shift. And so this lies at the heart of what you try to do.
Absolutely. And you walk the talk and talk the walk in everything you do. Very clear. So just talking through those components, through your career, have you had any mentors or those who have helped shepherd you to where you have arrived today?
Many. Sometimes you get mentored by people in skills who you don't admire on other levels. Like the first boss who hired me was a notorious homophobe. And this is back in the late 1970s. He'd write columns about, which were basically anti-gay screeds. I learnt good journalism out of him, the fundamentals of writing journalism out of him, but I wasn't interested in other values. I've had other bosses down through the years I've learnt stuff from. You learn something from everyone as you go and then you move along. But I had the great privilege when I was sent as a youngish reporter to London as a London correspondent for the Nine Network. They had a wonderful boss in that office called Robert Penfold. And Robert I learnt from him, what I learnt, he reinforced what I hoped to be true. And that was that you can be a very, very effective journalist. And Robert was a fabulous journalist. And you didn't have to have essentially a knife in your pocket, a razor blade in your shoe. It didn't have to be a brutal winner-takes-all fight with your competitors, for example. If your competitor's camera bust, then you would give them your pictures. That was his approach. And I realized that you can live the right values of generosity to all and do great journalism. Robert was a fine example of that. And I found that was a huge relief. I felt that I was not in any internal conflict about the job and, what it might require of me. And so I'm grateful to him for that, because I think that helped give me another 30 years of journalism where I've really enjoyed it and tried to live to those values as well. In the end, we're all vulnerable people. And in journalism, you're often meeting people at their most vulnerable. And our job is not to make things worse. It's to, where you can, do what needs to be done, but also just deal with it in a way that involves compassion and certainly where a notion of kind of inter-television network competition has no place in that. You do the best you can do and you hope you do a good job of it.
Absolutely.
But you do it with the dignity of particularly of the people that you're dealing with as the foremost thing in your head.
And do you mentor any people today?
I've done so in a formal sense in a number of ways. I would hope that I've done it in an informal way. I'm not sure which one is more valuable.
I think all are valuable.
Some people are quite forward. They say, will you be my mentor? This is what I need. And they're quite formalized about it. And there are some formalized structures of mentorship.
Sure.
And I've been involved in that. I've taken great pleasure in mentoring young Aboriginal journalists, many of whom come in. And then after a while, they leave because they leave journalism because with their skills and their intelligence, etc., and the sheer range of disadvantage that still exists in their world, they want to be activists. They don't want to be straight old-fashioned, journalists. That seems to take too long, and then they want to keep going. Some of them do stay on in straight journalism per se, but that's been a fascinating experience and a welcome one for me.
I can imagine. And you learn so much from them, and they learn so much from you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, we're always learning from other people all the time. Incredible. All levels, yeah.
It's certainly a pleasure I have in terms of mentoring younger people. Keeps you engaged and relevant in so many ways. Yeah,
and the other thing you learn is that often the things which are most valuable to pass on are really very basic ideas, because there's so much noise if you're starting off of so many things that you're trying to work through. And often it's just helpful to have someone to say, the most important thing is you nail this and you nail that. And then just some practical things about how you manage stress in your working life, which is inevitably going to start, and which can seem a little overwhelming when you're just starting off. And that could be interpersonal stresses within an office environment. It could be how to manage sleep when you're on your first overseas posting in different time zones with a high level of demand. How do you stop yourself from spinning out because you've gone, if you're not careful, you'll go 72 hours without a wink of sleep. Sure. And then things don't seem to make as much sense anymore. So, just how to do those practical things can be really useful as well.
And very much the small things you don't think about as being important, the mentoree finds incredibly valuable.
Well, I hope so. I'm also conscious that for some, I'm the old guy in the corner and they've got no idea what I've done. And there's, probably in the back of their minds going, geez, it's a great place to work. I really like working here. They seem to have this old guy here, but they're not quite sure what he does. Why are they still paying him? So there's always that. You've got to keep a certain modesty about how you're perceived in the eyes of others.
True. And so lastly, what advice would you give young people in terms of starting out in a career? What are some of the life's lessons that would help young people really have a step up in terms of what they need to think about in their career?
I would say that your values, you do not need to, you should not see that your life requires a trade-off of your core values and what you think is the best of you for something else, whether it's advancement, paychecks, all kinds of things. You will succeed within your values. The path may not be totally clear, but you will succeed within your values. So there is no need to trade that down for any reason at all. And the only other thing I would say is that in any environment where you're working, learn from everyone that you can, and different people have got different skills. So identify what their skills might be and try and learn from those people. Even you don't have to get on with them. You might recognize that they're hopeless at a bunch of things, but they might be really good at something. Someone might be very good at time management. Learn that from them. And then when you're in an environment where you think, I've got it here, there's no one else, I'm not learning anything more. It doesn't matter how comfortable that's become or what promises of advancement there might be in the future. If you're not learning in an environment, get out and then discombobulate yourself again and then learn again, because that is the most useful thing, is to constantly refresh the challenge.
Absolutely. And that's something you do incredibly well. Every day we see you on the TV, you've always got another story and another idea. Hugh, thank you so much for your wonderful insights, your wisdom, and greatly appreciate you taking the time to chat to us on the Personal Brand Catalyst.
Privileged to chat with you, Garry.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe for more episodes. And if you'd like to learn more about developing your personal brand, please visit garrybrowne.com.au to get in touch or grab a copy of Brand New, Brand You.